The Aztecs lived in Mexico, in North America. Mexico was home to many tribes migrating from North, Central, and South America. The islands where the Aztecs founded their city was situated in Lake Texcoco. The surrounding land was gradually taken over by the Aztecs, except for the lands of Tlaxcala and Tenochtitlan. To modern eyes, Aztec culture presents many surprising contrasts. The Aztecs had no wheels, no plows, and no horses, yet they were very successful farmers. The Aztec civilization was based on war and conquest, but the warrior nobles also loved poetry, incense, and flowers.
The Aztecs did not originally live in Mexico. They migrated there, probably from lands to the north during the 12th and 13th centuries AD. This was a time of drought and famine in many parts of America, when other tribes and peoples left their homes in search of food and especially fresh water. There was also political unrest following the collapse of the powerful Toltec state. According to Mexican legends, the Aztec people were poor hunters who wandered for years through desert lands, carrying with them a statue of their god. He was called Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun, and the Aztecs believed they were guided and protected by him.
Huitzilopochtli guided the Aztecs to the Valley of Mexico and to Lake Texcoco around 1300 AD. Other people had been living here at the time, and the Aztecs worked for the rulers of these towns. In 1345, the Aztecs moved to an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco and began to build houses and temples. They said their god, Huitzilopochtli, had told them to find the spot where an eagle stood on a cactus holding a snake, and to settle there. They called the site Tenochtitlan, which means place of the fruit of the prickly pear cactus. This was the beginning of the Aztecs' rise to power. The Aztecs became strong enough to defeat even the most powerful people in the area, the Azcapotzalcos. The surrounding land was gradually taken over by the Aztecs, except for the lands of Tlaxcala and Tenochtitlan.
Even though there are hardly any surviving buildings from the Aztec Empire and few objects, we know more about the Aztec people than any other American civilization that existed before AD 1500. Most of our evidence comes from books and documents drawn up as a result of the Spanish invasion, which started in 1519. Unfortunately, most of the buildings and objects the Aztecs created were destroyed by the Spanish. For example, the Great Temple in Tenochtitlan was pulled down and its rubble used to build a cathedral. Spanish explorers took priests with them to Mexico to teach the conquered peoples about the Christian faith. Some of these religious teachers were scholarly men who became interested in the Aztec people and wanted to learn more about their civilization. With the help of interpreters, they interviewed scribes, citizens, and villagers to find out what their life was like.
We also have evidence from codices, which were folding picture books written by Aztec scribes. These were compiled in picture writing. The Aztecs did not use letters, and had a system of dots to represent numbers. Early Aztec codices are a mixture of calendar and history books. They record important events, the activities of priests and kings, and astronomical observations.
The Mendoza Codex, like other Aztec codices, contains a great deal of information about Aztec life. For example, Codex illustrations tell us about warrior costumes, jewelry, and woven cloaks. Codices also show scenes from everyday life, like a messenger holding a staff or a musician playing a drum. Antonio de Mendoza, the Spanish governor in Mexico, ordered this codex to be made as a record of life in 16th century Mexico. He sent it as a present to the King of Spain. Sadly, a lot of earlier examples of Aztec picture writing were burned by Spanish missionaries who considered many of them to be works of the devil. The Aztec capital city was built on an island in a lake. The Spanish conquerors destroyed it and built a new city on the site. Today, the lake is almost dried up and the dry land of the island is shrinking. This makes the Spanish buildings collapse. Many Aztec ruins have been found beneath later buildings. Aztec men and women were expected to marry. The family provided an essential life support system. Without it, an individual would find it hard to survive. The Aztecs believed that husbands and wives should both work hard. People in a Calpuli might help a young couple set up home with gifts from their store of tribute, but after that, they were responsible for their own welfare.
Wives were told that they must be strong, busy, and energetic. Children were expected to be busy, too. From the age of about 4 or 6, they had to perform their share of the family's work. For girls, this was cooking and cleaning. Boys might help in the family business, or go fishing, or work in the fields. Girls stayed at home until they were about 16. Boys could attend school part-time until they were about 20. Then they could marry. Boys left school to be married at about age 20. Marriages were arranged by the parents, who consulted a soothsayer to find out if the couple was a suitable match. The soothsayer also made sure that the day chosen for the marriage was a good one. On the night of the wedding, the bride was led to the bridegroom's house, where the couple sat together and exchanged presents. The matchmaker tied the young couple's clothes together to show that they were now partners for life. Afterwards, a huge feast was given in honor of the newly married couple.
The birth of a baby was a happy event. Children were loved and welcomed by Aztec families, but were taught not to expect a happy life. When a baby was born, the midwife welcomed him or her with the following words: "Precious feather, you have come to earth, which is a place of torment, a place of pain, where it is hot, where it is cold, where the wind blows. It is a place of illness, of weariness, of thirst, hunger, and weeping." Although the newborn baby could not understand these words, they tell us a great deal about what the Aztecs expected from life. Relatives gave the baby presents which were meant to prepare it for life. Boys were given miniature shields and weapons in the hope that they would grow up to become warriors. Girls were given little work boxes in preparation for life as a wife and mother. Parents were encouraged to be strict with their children. The Aztecs thought it would help them grow into hard-working, obedient members of the community. But some of the approved punishments for laziness, rudeness, or disobedience seem appalling to us today. Some punishments included being made to breathe smoke from a fire where hot chili peppers were burning, or being left outside in the cold with the hands and feet tied. Children were expected to work hard. At an early age, they helped their parents by collecting firewood and water. Later, they were expected to work alongside their parents. Boys would learn to hunt and help with the crops. They could also learn skills associated with a trade. Girls were expected to help their mothers at home. They learned how to spin and weave, and also helped with housework, such as cleaning and cooking.
All Aztec boys were required to go to school when they reached the ages of 10 to 12. The sons of rich parents were sent to a Calmacac, which was a religious school run by priests. Here, they learned to read and write using glyphs and studied history, medicine, and astrology. Life in a Calmacac was very difficult. Boys lived on tortillas and water and slept on the hard bare floors. They were awakened several times at night to offer incense to the gods. Boys were expected to work hard. They helped the priests in ceremonies and also worked on the land belonging to the temple. When they left the Calmacac, boys could become government officials, doctors, or priests. Girls did not usually attend school, but some did go to the Calmacac and train to be priestesses or doctors.
Boys who were trained to become warriors went to a Telpakkali, a school where they were taught to use weapons like bows and arrows, spears, swords, and the macahuitl. At first, they learned to fight using wooden weapons, but later learned to use real ones and even followed warriors into battle. When the boys were not practicing fighting, they were expected to work in the fields and on the canals.
Maize formed the Aztecs' basic diet. It was ground into coarse flour and cooked to make tortillas, tamales, or gruel. Aztec people liked spicy foods, so women used plenty of hot chilies and milder sweet peppers, along with tomatoes, honey, and herbs. The Aztecs used chilies to flavor their food. For punishments, and in medicines. Tortillas were eaten with beans and vegetable stew, or for special occasions, with eggs, roast turkey, rabbit, ants, locusts, deer, or even with stewed dog. Before the Spaniards arrived, there were no cows, sheep, pigs, or horses.
Spanish explorers believed that the Aztecs could survive on remarkably little food. After a poor harvest or in late spring, when stocks of food were running low, this may have been true, but Aztec cooks had also developed many rich, flavorful recipes, making good use of all the food resources their lands could provide.
Lakes and ditches provided fish, and also frogs, turtles, tadpoles, and lizards. Men and boys scooped a green scum, rich in fish eggs, from the water's surface. Water was the usual drink, but a powerful beer could be made from the sap of the maguey cactus. Rich people drank chocolate, made from pounded cocoa beans, boiled to a froth with water, and flavored with vanilla and honey. Roasted salted gourd seeds were eaten as a snack. At feasts and ceremonies, drugs made from cactus buds and fungi were offered. These could produce dangerous, disturbing visions or fits of laughter.
Cocoa was a valuable crop. Cocoa trees grew best in the hot, damp coastal regions of the Aztec Empire and were sent to Tenochtitlan as tribute. The cocoa beans were ground and boiled up with water to make a thick, sticky, chocolate-flavored foam. This drink was offered to the gods during ritual worship. The Aztecs called it chocolatl, and when the Spanish took cacao back to Europe, they took the name as well, chocolate.
Making tortillas has remained the same for hundreds of years. Now, maize is ground into a coarse flour with a stone roller on a special stone called a metate, then mixed with water into a dough. The dough is then patted by hand into thin cakes, which are cooked on a griddle over an open fire and served with a meat or vegetable sauce.
The Aztecs reared a special breed of dog to provide meat for eating. Because they lived in a warm climate, the dogs were almost hairless. They were treated like pets around the house until it was time for them to be killed. Travelers reported that dog meat was very tasty.
Every Aztec family had pottery. It was used for storing water, for cooking, and for soaking beans and maize. There were special pottery dishes for cooking tortillas and for grating chilies.
Most of the people in the Aztec Empire were farmers. Aztec farmers and their families worked hard, long hours to grow food for all the people of the empire. Rulers, priests, nobles, and ordinary citizens relied on workers in the countryside to raise good crops and send them to the cities as tribute. In emergencies, extra supplies could be bought from neighboring lands. But if the rains failed, or if the frost came early, a whole year's food could be lost. This was one of the reasons why the Aztecs conquered distant territories. If the harvest was poor in one region, they hoped it might be better elsewhere. The farmer's main tool was a long stick that was flattened on one end. They used this to turn the soil, pull out weeds, or to plant seeds. Farmers in different parts of the Aztec Empire cultivated their land in different ways. In the hot lands of the south, they cleared small fields from the dense rainforest. They grew cocoa, pineapples, and sweet potatoes. On the dry, dusty hills, there were cactus plantations. One variety, known as the maguey, provided fiber for weaving, thatching, baskets, and rope. Its juice could be used as a sweetener, and its sharp spines were used in religious rituals. Prickly pear cactus supplied refreshing fruit. The essential maize crop was grown in this region twice a year, along with squashes and gourds.
Fruit, flowers, and vegetables were planted in chinampas, or gardens, created along the lake edge, or around Tenochtitlan, in the middle of the lake itself. Farmers made a strong framework of twigs and branches, weighted it with stones, and sank it into the water. On top, they poured rich, dark mud dredged from the lake bottom, compost, and manure. To stop their garden from washing away, they fenced it with hurdles and planted willow trees all around. The tangled roots bound the soil together. Properly managed, these chinampas could grow up to 7 crops every year. On the steep hillsides, where daytime temperatures were baking hot and the night could be very cold, The Aztecs grew plants that were tougher than their main crops of beans, maize, and squashes. Shea was a short, bushy plant. It produced seeds that could be stewed to make porridge. Woutley was another plant grown for seeds. They were ground and mixed with water to make dough. These frost-resistant crops provided an important emergency food supply if the main harvest failed through bad weather, floods, or drought. Aztec farmers also used the mountain slopes to rear the local variety of black, stingless bees, which produced high-priced honey. In more sheltered mountain valleys, market gardeners grew avocados, papaya, sweet potatoes, and, in the south, vanilla and pineapples. People need to eat all year round, but Mexican weather was unpredictable. To try to make sure of a steady food supply, laws were passed fixing the dates when each crop should be planted.
The maguey cactus was the most useful plant the Aztecs grew. The tip of its leaves could be cut off with a length of fibers still attached, making an instant needle and thread. Maguey fibers were woven into mats, ropes, cloth, nets, and bags. Dried leaves could be made into paper. Maguey sap, collected and boiled to make syrup, was used to sweeten food. Sap was also used to make an alcoholic drink called Achtli. Older Aztecs, who were allowed to drink alcohol, enjoyed it very much.
The prickly pear cactus flourishes in Mexican desert lands. Although its fruits are armed with fierce spikes, the flesh inside is cool and refreshing. Prickly pears were harvested and carried to market in Tenochtitlan.
Remains of Aztec floating gardens survive today at Xochimilco, close to Tenochtitlan, and people still travel through them in boats. Aztec farmers grew crops on them and raised animals and birds to feed the rapidly growing population of Tenochtitlan.
The Chinampa system of cultivation needed large quantities of fertilizer to grow crops. Otherwise, the soil would become exhausted and yields would fall. Farmers also grew flowers to sell in the city markets and raised turkeys on any spare ground. Spanish explorers noted that Aztec farmers made compost from rotting vegetables, but they were puzzled by the wickerwork cabins they saw beside country roads or lining the city streets. The farmers explained that these were public lavatories. Servants collected human manure from them and spread it over the chinampas. It helped the crops to grow.
Despite all these crops, famines were recorded in many parts of Mexico during Aztec times. In the cities, calpulis kept stocks of basic foodstuffs, but when times were hard, these were quickly used up. Chroniclers reported that in severe famines, Aztec parents sold their children into slavery in distant lands. They hoped that the children would be fed and cared for by their new owners. Slavery was better than starvation. Aztec merchants also sent messengers to far-off countries to report on harvest conditions and food supplies there.
Aztecs went hunting and fishing to find most of their food. They used snares and bows and arrows to catch rabbits, opossum, tapir, and armadillos. They trapped snakes, salamanders, and locusts as they basked in the sun. On the lake, they caught fish and hunted for frogs and turtles. They also caught water birds like the Muscovy duck. In many societies, clothes and jewels act as status symbols. They display the wearer's wealth and make clear his or her position in society. It was the same for the Aztecs. Laws were passed telling nobles and ordinary people what clothes they might wear. It was a serious crime, punishable by death if the criminal repeated the offense, to wear garments allocated to a richer, more powerful group. Ordinary men, for example, could not wrap themselves in long cloaks unless their legs had been badly scarred in battle. Ordinary women could not appear in fine jewelry. Both were reserved for noble families to wear. Aztec clothing was simple. Ordinary people could only wear clothes woven from agave fiber, but nobles wore clothes of richly embroidered cotton. Most garments were made from a single length of cloth, without any shaping. But Aztec weavers could produce such elaborate patterns and rich colors that these simple clothes looked rich and attractive. For ordinary men, everyday clothes consisted of a simple loincloth plus a length of fabric knotted on one shoulder to act as a cloak. Women wore a long, loose blouse over a skirt, reaching almost to the ground. These clothes were made of fiber from the maguey cactus. The more comfortable and expensive cotton was for nobles only, spun and woven on a simple backstrap loom by all the women in the family. Thicker cloaks might be made from woven rabbit fur, but it took an extremely long time to collect and spin enough fine, fluffy rabbit hairs to make a cloak. Both blouses and cloaks could be embroidered or woven with brightly colored patterns along the hem.
Wealthy nobles and rulers wore clothes similar to ordinary people, but in finer fabrics and richer colors. From the Aztec treasures that have survived, we can tell that noblemen and noble women could also afford elegant jewelry, necklaces and collars made of pearls, turquoise, and gold, or glittering brooches inlaid with religious designs. Codex drawings show us the magnificent ceremonial costumes worn by knights and nobles leading troops into war. There were some ornaments that could only be worn by the emperor. Rulers, warriors, and priests also wore magnificent headdresses and sometimes masks. These were often beautiful objects in themselves, but were really designed to make the wearer look more powerful than ordinary men.
Aztec hairstyles gave information about a person's status. For instance, you could tell whether a woman was married at a glance. Unmarried women wore their hair loose and flowing, and married women pulled their hair up in plaits on either side of their heads. Warriors wore top knots, but young men who had not killed in battle were forced to leave some of their hair uncut, a shameful sign which suggested that they were not yet real men.
The Aztecs admired the people who had ruled in Mexico before them. They traveled to the ruins of their cities and prayed in their temples. They sometimes even copied their style of architecture, art, and religion. Aztec power was based on war. The Aztecs had won their homeland in battle. They needed to keep fighting to preserve and enlarge their lands. Aztec men and women were trained to be obedient citizens. In wartime, political debates and new ideas were not encouraged. The Aztecs relied on war for a steady supply of tribute from conquered cities. Tribute was a kind of tax of food, rich treasures, and raw materials like cocoa or cotton, which the Aztecs used to feed their growing population and to provide luxuries for their rulers and nobles. Most important of all, the Aztecs needed wars to provide captives, to kill as human sacrifices to nourish their gods.
People were either nobles, commoners, or belonged to a special group that included craftspeople and merchants. Men who held high government positions or who were priests were considered nobles. Women could be nobles if their husband or families were. She could also own land or run a business by herself. Nobles were expected to do their jobs well and were rewarded with fine houses and slaves. Most people were farmers who were considered commoners, even though they had one of the most important jobs in the empire. Farmers had certain rights that were protected by law and were required to pay taxes in return. From their earliest days, Aztec men and women were trained to be good citizens. In the early 16th century, according to the Spanish chroniclers, the Aztecs believed that the ideal boy was obedient, intelligent, respectful.
Aztec living conditions may have helped cause common Aztec diseases. Recorded illnesses included dysentery, fevers, chest infections, and skin complaints. They could have all been made worse by stagnant or contaminated drinking water, overcrowding, and an unbalanced diet. Many men were wounded in battle, and many women died in childbirth. Old people suffered from rheumatism or from trouble with their teeth.
Aztec medicine was a mixture of practical good sense, a knowledge of plants, and religious magic. Patients might be advised to take mixtures of herbs and spices, to fast, or to follow a special diet. For example, men who had injured their heads were not to eat meat or fish. They might be encouraged to have a sweat bath, to avoid cold and drafts, to say special prayers, or just to trust in the doctor's spells. Men and women could be doctors. Only women acted as midwives. Sometimes their remedies helped. Aztec doctors recognized over 130 medicinal plants, and several Aztec herbal prescriptions have been approved in recent years. At other times, Aztec magic and medicine may unfortunately have hastened the patient's death.
The Aztecs believed that the gods controlled human lives. They also believed in ghosts, curses, and evil spirits. Much Aztec medicine was aimed at these forces to persuade them to leave the sick patient. So Aztec doctors chanted spells and whispered magic charms. Some Aztec medicines were very useful, but others, like morning glory seeds, peyote, and certain types of mushroom, were very dangerous. They contained mind-altering drugs and could cause severe mental illness. The Aztecs also used tobacco for smoking and healing.
Baths were used for getting clean and to purify someone recovering from illness. Steam baths were rather like a present-day sauna. Bathers sat inside a small cabin, and a fire was lit outside on the walls. Water was then poured over the wall heated by the fire, creating clouds of steam that filled the cabin. The Aztecs counted in units of 20. Dots, fingers, and other symbols were used to write numbers.
The Aztecs wrote in the form of small pictures called glyphs. Strict rules governed the writing of glyphs, and priests were specially trained to read and write them in books of history and religion. Important people were drawn larger than others, and people who were far away were drawn at the top of a page. The books themselves were written on the bark of wild fig trees, coated with a varnish, and stuck together to form long strips. The scribes wrote on both sides of the bark, and the finished book was folded like a map.
Religion was a very powerful force in the Aztec world. It affected everyone, from the Tlahtoani himself to the most miserable prisoner or slave. As the Aztecs said, the gods governed everything. It was pointless to try to go against their wishes, but they could sometimes be influenced by gifts and sacrifices. The Aztecs believed the world had been destroyed 4 times. The gods sacrificed themselves to create the sun and the 5th world in which the Aztecs lived. The Aztecs thanked their gods and helped the sun in its battle against the stars and moon by offering gifts, the most important gift being human sacrifice. Without these gifts, the Aztecs believed, the world would come to an end. The Aztecs believed in 2 different families of gods: the ancient gods, who had been worshipped by peoples living in Mexico for thousands of years, and their own gods, such as Huitzilopochtli. He was the god of the life-giving sun, who rewarded his followers with victory in war. The Aztecs also feared his mother, the earth goddess, Coatlicue. She was always shown wearing a skirt made out of poisonous snakes. This suggests that the Aztecs thought of the natural world as powerful but cruel. Many other ancient gods were connected with natural forces. The Aztecs believed they had to please these gods if they wanted their crops to grow. Tlaloc was the god of rain. Early in the spring, priests killed children as a sacrifice to him. The more the children cried, the more the priests believed it would rain that year. Xipe Totec was a fertility god. He helped plants to grow. His worshippers shot at their sacrificial victims with bows and arrows. The blood that poured from their wounds helped fertilize the earth. For the Aztecs, war, farming, and religion were all part of the great cycle. A time of war always followed the harvest. Then, prisoners caught during war were sacrificed in the temples. This was followed by a period of planting new crops. Next was the Feast of the Flaying of Men, in which more prisoners were skinned and their hearts offered to the gods. The skulls of sacrificed victims were displayed in the main square of Tenochtitlan. The Tzompantli, or skull rack, contained the skulls of thousands of victims. Not all gods and goddesses were bloodthirsty. For example, Xilonen was a kindly, gentle goddess who protected the young maize crop. She was honored by ordinary Aztec men and women, particularly by farmers and market gardeners. She may have attracted just as many worshippers as the fearsome Tlaloc or Coatlicue.
An important religious symbol to the Aztecs was the double-headed serpent. This symbolized skill, strength, and wisdom.
Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, god of wisdom, priesthood, and learning. The fact that many Aztecs, including Montezuma himself, believed ancient prophecies about Quetzalcoatl's return helped Cortez to conquer the Aztec Empire surprisingly quickly.
Coatlicue, the fearsome earth goddess, gave birth to the Aztecs' national god, Huitzilopochtli, the moon goddess, Coyolxauhqui, and the 400 stars that Aztec astronomers counted in the sky.
Xalxiuhtlicue was the goddess of running water and streams.
Tezcatlipoca was the god of wind and magic.
The goddess Tlazolteotl watched over women in childbirth. Women who died giving birth were honored, but they were also feared. The Aztecs believed that their ghosts haunted streets and crossroads at night. It was very bad luck to meet one.
Xipe-Totec was the god of springtime, new growth, and renewal. Priests worshipped him by killing and then skinning specially chosen men. They wore the dead man's skin to encourage a new skin of fresh green shoots to cover the earth.
Xiuhtecutli was the god of fire. Many Aztecs believed they would go cold and hungry without his help, so they gave offerings to him. One god, Tlahtoani, was said to have created the world, but then withdrew from it.
Tlaloc was the ancient god of water, worshipped throughout Mexico. The Aztecs believed he could also punish people by wrecking crops with floods. In the 6th month, priests held special ceremonies in Tlaloc's honor. They also fed victims' hearts to the god by throwing them in the lake.
Xochipilli, or Flower Prince, was the god of love, happiness, music, dancing, and gambling. With his twin sister, Xochiquetzal, he was worshipped in a spring festival held at the great temple of Huitzilopochtli. Even though he was young, Xochipilli was always portrayed with a dead man's face.
People believed that unless their gods were constantly prayed to and fed with human blood, the gods would die. If that happened, the sun would no longer move across the sky, the earth would grow dark and cold, and all creatures would perish. Bloody sacrifices also acted out Aztec myths about the creation. Then, at the beginning of the world, the gods had all sacrificed themselves in order to give life to the sun. The Aztecs constantly invaded neighboring states. They needed plenty of captives to kill to give life to their gods. Convicted criminals and specially purchased slaves could also be sacrificed. Men who were sacrificed were sure of a happy life after death. For 4 years, they acted as companions to the sun. Then, they returned to Earth as carefree hummingbirds or butterflies. Heads of victims were arranged on racks outside the temples. Altars where killings took place were also decorated with rows of skulls. Many fine objects made by Aztec craftsmen and craftswomen have been lost or destroyed, but enough survives to show just how skillful they were. Spanish missionaries also left descriptions of Aztec treasures, like the solid gold bird with a movable tongue, head, and wings, and a fish with all its scales, which they thought was better than anything produced in Spain. From the evidence left, it appears that the Aztecs were extremely skilled craftsmen. The tools that they used were very basic, which only adds to the brilliance of their work. Each group of craftsmen organized its own guild. They lived and worked in the same part of the city. Aztec potters made simple cooking bowls and more elaborate vases and dishes for use in wealthy homes. All pots were coiled by hand. The Aztecs did not use a potter's wheel, and were decorated with different colored clays or with patterns scratched on the surface. Aztec women made many fine textiles, woven from cotton or cactus fiber and dyed with strange mixtures of earth and herbs. A favorite red dye was cochineal, made from the bodies of tiny insects. Children gathered them from cactus plants. It took about 70,000 insects to make a pound of dye. Artists were greatly respected. Children of the wealthier families were encouraged to learn a craft. People in each region of the empire had their own specialty. Like the Mixtecs, who worked with gold and mosaics, women spun and wove beautiful cloths. And there were artists who worked with jewels and feather workers who created costumes. Metalsmiths and sculptors also created religious statues and jewelry. Earrings, lip plugs, nose rings, pendants, and hair ornaments were all delicately made of gold, silver, and precious stones. Small fragments of jade, crystal, turquoise, and polished bone were used to make jeweled mosaics, including terrifying masks worn by priests based on real human skulls. Knives and axes used to sacrifice prisoners were also made of rare and beautiful stones, like black obsidian or orange-red chalcedony. Feathers were used to decorate headdresses, clothes, and shields. Featherwork was a slow and very costly process. Whole families were usually involved. Men traced the design onto stiffened cloth and arranged thousands and thousands of feathers to make magical, brightly colored designs. Women cleaned and sorted the feathers, while children swept up or mixed the glue.
Aztec clothes and weapons were often decorated with beautiful patterns. Many of these had a special meaning. From the top, a shield decorated with a pattern probably symbolizing earth and sky, a temple pyramid design, a two-headed snake, and at the bottom, a death's head or skull.
Aztec craftsmen made many beautiful objects out of gold and silver. Only a few survive. The others were taken back to Spain and melted down for reuse in coins. Aztec gold and silver jewelry combined big, bold designs with astonishingly delicate, skillful workmanship.
The Aztec ball game Tlahtoani could be extremely difficult and dangerous to play. Only noblemen who could afford the time to train and paid professional players took part. Serious injuries were common because players often crashed into the walls or fell to the floor. The ball they played with was solid and very heavy. One way of scoring was to hit this ball through the stone rings using only the knees and hips. Winners received rich prizes, and the losing team might be sacrificed to the gods. Ball courts were laid out like a capital letter I. Sometimes the floors were divided into 4 quarters, each painted a different color. The stone rings along the side were placed very high, often 13 to 16 feet above the ground, and at an awkward angle for the players to aim. This was a game played with dried beans, marked like dice, and colored counters. Players threw the beans and moved their counters across an X-shaped board. Like the ball game, Patali had a religious meaning. The moves made by the counters symbolized the passing years. But players often forgot about this. They became very excited during a game, shouting, saying prayers, whispering to the beans, and making bets. Some Aztec men became addicted to the game and carried a set of beans and counters with them wherever they went. Some men even gambled away their families' belongings and ended up as slaves. 2 very popular Aztec festivals were concerned with the calendar cycles. One was Volador, which involved 4 men dressed as birds and attached to strong ropes, jumping off a very high pole. As they spun around, they circled the pole 13 times each. Together, this made 52 circuits, the length of an Aztec calendar cycle. The men's flight mimicked the movement of the sun and, the Aztecs hoped, encouraged it to continue.
Land was only firm enough to hold stone buildings in the center of Tenochtitlan. Outside the center, people lived in houses made of lighter materials. Ordinary Aztec families lived in single-story homes made of mud bricks dried in the sun and covered with layers of whitewash. In Tenochtitlan, where living space was carefully planned, several houses were arranged around a central courtyard leading off the city streets, footpaths, or canals. In the countryside, houses and farm buildings were clustered around the village square. Poor families sometimes had only 1 room in their house. However, a typical house might have had 3 or 4 rooms and provided accommodation for 10 to 15 people. Some people needed workrooms as well as living rooms. It was not unusual to find workshops as well as storerooms in an Aztec house. Houses were built around a courtyard where children could play and women could sew and spin. A canal was usually found bordering one side of the house, and each family had its own landing area. Several generations of one family shared a single home: parents, children, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and cousins. Rich people sometimes had slaves to tend their gardens and wait on them. Inside, the houses were very plain, with whitewashed walls and hard earth floors. Furniture was simple. Food and clothes were stored in baskets or heavy wooden chests. Most people sat and slept on mats on the floor. A few wealthy families had chairs and stools made of woven willow branches. Food was cooked on open fires, in pottery dishes and pans, and served from communal bowls.
Many Aztec houses were painted with whitewash. This helped to protect their mud walls and to keep them cool by reflecting sunlight. As the city of Tenochtitlan grew, so many houses were built that the lake became polluted by chemicals produced when whitewash was made. Mexico City holds many Aztec secrets. Underneath the buildings that stand today, some evidence has been unearthed of the old Aztec city. For example, the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Mexico City was built by the Spanish conquerors just a few yards from an Aztec holy site, the Great Temple, Tenochtitlan. Here, it is as it might have appeared around 1519, towering above priests and people, a holy and terrifying place. Reconstructions like this one are based on excavations of temple ruins, on drawings in codices, and on the remains of other temples in cities nearby. The Aztecs did not use wheeled transport, although they did know about wheels. Probably they found carts too awkward to use on their steep, narrow mountain roads. Also, they had no strong animals to pull them. Horses and donkeys were unknown. So, messengers and merchants traveled across the countryside on foot, sometimes bent double under heavy loads until they reached their destination, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, and a great center of all kinds of trade. All kinds of materials, as well as foodstuffs, had to be carried into the city of Tenochtitlan from the surrounding countryside.
The various districts of the city were linked to each other and to the mainland by 3 stone causeways built high above the surface of the lake. There were many roads and paths, but the citizens often traveled by boat through the swamps or along the drainage canals.
It was easier traveling on the lake than going along the shore. The most common craft was a simple canoe, steered with a paddle. The Tlahtoani was war leader, head of the government, and ruler of the Aztecs and the neighboring city-states. He was also immensely wealthy. He governed with the help of army commanders, judges, town leaders, rulers of conquered cities, and other noblemen. In theory, he was chosen for his abilities from among the whole community, but in practice, he was selected by a group of important nobles from young men closely related to the last Tlahtoani. Often, they were his brothers or sons. His chief duty was to look after the well-being of his people.
Quetzalcoatl was in charge of the day-to-day running of the government. He was chief judge in the law courts, supervised thousands of government officials, and organized the elections for each new Tlahtoani. As other nobles involved in government, the Quetzalcoatl paid no taxes, lived in a house provided by the state, and was given a guaranteed income. Less important nobles were entitled to respect, but had to work hard to earn their own living. In Aztec society, wealth was not always passed on from father to son. Instead, it depended on government posts held or on brave deeds in battle. A common soldier could become a noble if he captured 4 enemy soldiers alive.
Laws were made by each Aztec ruler, and criminals were tried by judges appointed by the state. To us, some laws might seem very harsh, but the Aztecs would have claimed that they were acting for society's good. There were also rules designed to maintain the distinctions between different groups in society. For example, only noble families could live in a house 2 stories high. Aztec society was divided into calpulis or clans. Each calpuli was based in a particular district of a city. It was responsible for encouraging the good behavior of all its members. A child was registered as a calpuli member when it was born, thus establishing its place in Aztec society. Each district owned a certain amount of land and received a share of the tribute sent from conquered cities. It maintained its own temple, chose its own leader, and collected taxes. Aztec laws were designed to keep the population quiet and obedient. Alcohol, in particular, was strictly controlled. It was forbidden to anyone under 30. Above that age, you could drink it at weddings or when you were sick. Only the old could drink freely. The punishment for many crimes was death. First offenders were punished and then set free. But if they committed the same crime again, they were killed.
Most of the people in the Aztec Empire were farmers. Aztec farmers and their families worked hard, long hours to grow food for all the people of the empire. Rulers, priests, nobles, and ordinary citizens relied on workers in the countryside to raise good crops and send them to the cities as tribute. In emergencies, extra supplies could be bought from neighboring lands. But if the rains failed, or if the frost came early, a whole year's food could be lost. This was one of the reasons why the Aztecs conquered distant territories. If the harvest was poor in one region, they hoped it might be better elsewhere.
The rebel city of Tlatelolco grew up right next door to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs conquered it in 1473. It was already an important trading town. After the Aztec conquest, it became a great market for the entire empire. One Spanish 16th century traveler wrote that nowhere else in the world was so large a marketplace and so full of people and so well governed and arranged. He added that the noise of people buying and selling could be heard about 3 miles away. Another Spanish chronicler reported that up to 50,000 customers came there on market days. At Tlatelolco, you could buy almost anything, from precious stones and feathers to salt and firewood. You could get a haircut, have your fortune told, or eat a tasty meal. Traders from the hot lands sold cocoa, cotton, spices, and honey. Mountain villagers sold copper and slaves. Farmers' wives offered specially fattened turkeys or small dogs. Fishermen had shells and pearls for sale. Craftworkers displayed fine products of all kinds: cloth, pottery, jewelry, baskets, sandals, and bells. The Aztecs did not use coins. Most trade was carried out by barter. Cocoa beans and quills filled with gold dust were also used to exchange for goods. Market officials were on hand to settle disputes and arrest tricksters and thieves. Merchants brought luxury goods for sale in the great market at Tlatelolco from all over the Aztec Empire and farther afield. Traders from north of Tlatelolco brought turquoise, chocolate, paper, and pineapple, while traders from the south brought gold, pottery, silver, and tobacco. Foreign trade was handled by specialist merchants who brought back valuable goods like feather, jade, skins, shells, rubber, and bitumen, a kind of tar. Aztec women and noblemen were very fond of flowers. They used them to scent the air. City streets and canals must have been smelly, particularly in the hot summer months. Women were the main traders in the fruit and flower markets. They brought goods in to sell, while their husbands worked in the chinampas.
The most important person in Aztec society was the Tlahtoani, which means the speaker. By about 1400, the Tlahtoani had become a very powerful king. He lived in a magnificent palace in the heart of Tenochtitlan, surrounded by servants, officials, and wives. He was always treated with great respect. The official known as Kiowacodal, or Snake Woman, was his deputy. Historians are not sure why this name was used, since as far as we know, the post was always held by a man. The Tlahtoani was war leader, head of the government, and ruler of the Aztecs and the neighboring city-states. He was also immensely wealthy. He governed with the help of army commanders, judges, town leaders, rulers of conquered cities, and other noblemen. In theory, he was chosen for his abilities from among the whole community. But in practice, he was selected by a group of important nobles, from young men closely related to the last Tlahtoani. Often they were his brothers or sons. His chief duty was to look after the well-being of his people.
Quetzalcoatl was in charge of the day-to-day running of the government. He was chief judge in the law courts, supervised thousands of government officials, and organized the elections for each new Tlahtoani. As other nobles involved in government, the Quetzalcoatl paid no taxes, lived in a house provided by the state, and was given a guaranteed income. Less important nobles were entitled to respect, but had to work hard to earn their own living. In Aztec society, wealth was not always passed on from father to son. Instead, it depended on government posts held or on brave deeds in battle. A common soldier could become a noble if he captured 4 enemy soldiers alive.
The royal palace, which stood proudly in the center of Tenochtitlan, was not just a royal home, it was also the government headquarters. Although the Tlahtoani Montezuma's palace was destroyed by the Spanish conquerors after 1521, their descriptions of it tell us that it was a most impressive building. One Spanish chronicler wrote, "I walked till I was tired and never saw the whole of it." He added that one of the largest rooms could seat 3,000 people. This gives us some idea of the palace's size and splendor. It was decorated with paintings and carvings and furnished with fine pottery, statues, and fabrics.
Since Aztec palaces have not survived, excavating royal homes built by earlier and neighboring civilizations can help us discover what Aztec palace life was like. The Quetzalcoatl and other advisors visited the palace to hold discussions about politics and warfare. There was a courthouse, a chapel decorated in gold and silver, offices where the scribes worked at their picture writing, a schoolroom, a library, and grand public chambers where the Tlahtoani feasted or entertained powerful nobles and visitors from neighboring states. It was reported that over 600 nobles came to Montezuma's palace every day. They consumed over 1,000 dishes of food, and their servants crowded the courtyards. Thousands of people were needed to run the great palace. There were rooms for builders and cleaners, for dancers and singers, and for servants, bodyguards, and slaves. There were kitchens, storerooms, and separate women's quarters where the Tlahtoani's wives and daughters spent much of their time spinning, weaving, and producing beautiful embroidery. The palace was surrounded by gardens and ponds, and also, rather surprisingly, by a large zoo full of rare exotic creatures. There was a special home in feather-filled jars for deadly rattlesnakes. All these animals and birds were well cared for, but made, as the Spaniards remarked, a hellish noise. Nobles and officials at the palace get a warning. They must quickly remove their cloaks and stop gossiping, and get into a respectful position, because Montezuma is returning from a journey. Spanish travelers reported that no one was allowed to look Montezuma in the face. Instead, they had to bow down and keep gazing at the floor. When they were close to him, they greeted him with the words, "Lord, my great lord." They were not allowed to turn their back on Montezuma, even when they were walking away. The Spaniards also described how Montezuma was carried on a litter, on the shoulders of noblemen, when he left the palace. If he got down to walk, cloaks were spread in front of him, so that his royal feet would not touch the earth. The ruler's life could be very lonely. Very few people, inside or outside the palace, ever met Montezuma. Aztec warriors were fierce in battle and were feared throughout Mexico. A soldier was given a higher rank based on the number of prisoners he took in battle. Different ranks among soldiers were displayed through different styles of clothing. The Tlahtoani, priests, and nobles were the chief war leaders. There were also brotherhoods of eagle, jaguar, and arrow knights, who combined skill in fighting with religious vows. Only the nobles could join, but all adult men were expected to leave their homes and join the army whenever the great war drum was sounded. Then the army assembled in units of 800 men and marched off to confront the enemy. Messengers were sent to arrange for supplies of food and water to be provided from friendly cities along the way. If the Aztecs were successful in battle, they took captives and sent in tribute collectors and their own local governors. Many of the conquered peoples were unhappy under Aztec rule, and there were often revolts. The army helped to quell these revolts and to protect the empire from enemies.
The Aztec warriors wore padded tunics and carried shields. They fought with spears, slings, and bows and arrows. Their most terrifying weapon was a macahuitl, a wooden club tipped with dozens of razor-sharp flakes of obsidian, a glassy volcanic rock. The Spaniards reported that one of these could cut the head off a horse. Aztec soldiers carried shields made from interlaced strips of wood and wore armor made of padded cotton soaked in salt and water. Wealthy warriors decorated their armor with patterns of colored feathers, gold, or detailed embroidery. The jaguar, eagle, and arrow knights wore carved wooden helmets and costumes made from animal skins and feathers.
Boys were taught to fight with weapons like these when they were still at school. They were thought to be ready for battle at 15. Warriors were not paid, but if they fought well, they were given clothes or slaves as a reward. The Aztecs also used magic to try to protect themselves in war. They ambushed funeral processions and robbed graves to cut off the hair and fingers of women who had died in childbirth. Warriors fixed the dead woman's hair and fingers to their shields to bring good luck.
An Aztec soldier ready for battle. He carries a magnificent feathered shield, spears, and an atlatl, and macahuitl, a club spiked with obsidian. Ceremonial costumes worn by knights and nobles leading Aztec troops to war were designed to fill their wearers with the strength of wild animals. They were made of fur, skins, feather, gold and silver discs, embroidered cotton, and strips of painted leather.
The Aztecs aimed to conquer other cities and to capture prisoners, not to wipe out their enemies. If they killed them all, there would be no prisoners and no tribute to help feed the Aztec people. Even so, it was a disgrace for an Aztec soldier to try to save his own skin. It was more honorable to be killed fighting or to be sacrificed than to survive. Stories were told of captured Aztec warriors who chose to die willingly rather than be ransomed or set free. They felt it was shameful and wrong to try to escape their fate.
The Aztecs established their capital city, Tenochtitlan, in the middle of a wide, shallow lake. At first, Tenochtitlan was just a huddle of huts made out of woven reeds, but it grew into the biggest city in the Americas. The Spaniards, who saw it in 1519, estimated that it housed almost 200,000 people. The city contained parks with fountains and even had a zoo with animals from all over the empire. The city's inhabitants were mainly Aztecs, but other people from all over the empire came to work and sometimes settled there. Tenochtitlan was divided into 4 districts: the Flowery Place, Mosquito Fen, Heron's Home, and in the center, the Place of the Gods. A vast area for temples was built here, circled by a strong wall almost 4,600 feet long. There were palaces for the Tlahtoani and for noble families, ball courts, schools, government buildings, and ordinary homes. Looking at the city from a distance, it seemed as if the temples and palaces rose out of the lake.
Tenochtitlan's central square was the main hub of the empire. All of the important ceremonies and festivals were held here, and the square was always crowded with many different types of people going about their business. There were nobles and government officials, as well as foreign tribesmen who brought tribute for the emperor. Priests climbed the steps of the temples, and elaborately dressed warriors strode through the crowds.
The temple precinct in the center of Tenochtitlan was the heart of the Aztec Empire. Here, the Aztecs built magnificent pyramids to honor their gods, like the temple to the feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl, the temple of the sun, the temple of Tezcatlipoca, and the great temple where sacrifices were performed. Heads of victims were arranged on racks outside the temples. The ball court for playing the ancient game of Tlachtli was located nearby. This central area of the city was surrounded by a wall decorated with carved snakes. Although their city was surrounded by water, the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan had problems finding enough to drink. By the 15th century, the lake grew salty, and freshwater springs began to dry up. In 1519, the Tlahtoani Montezuma heard strange rumors from government officials in distant parts of the Aztec Empire. Apparently, creatures looking like men but behaving like gods were terrorizing local people. At the same time, the Aztec priests were reporting other strange happenings, such as eclipses and the appearance of a comet with a flaming tail. These strangers were not gods, but Spanish soldiers with guns and horses who were beginning their march toward Tenochtitlan. Montezuma sent messengers to greet the Spaniards, who were led by a minor Spanish nobleman, Hernan Cortés, but both sides were suspicious of each other. With the help of an interpreter, a woman called Doña Marina, Hernan Cortés managed to persuade the Tlaxcalans to join them in battle against Tenochtitlan. With 5,000 troops, Cortés entered Tenochtitlan and was received with dignity by Montezuma. However, the Spaniards took Montezuma prisoner and tried to control the city. This failed because the Aztecs rebelled, and 2/3 of the Spanish soldiers were killed. Cortés escaped, but returned in 1521, captured the city again, and massacred the people. Cortés arrived on the coast of Mexico from Cuba in 1519. Slowly, he made his way over the harsh mountainous terrain toward Aztec lands. Before he reached Tenochtitlan, he made an alliance with the people of Tlaxcala and entered the city with them. The Aztecs fought hard and eventually forced the Spanish and their allies to retreat. However, Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan in 1521, and after another attack, he finally captured the city. The Aztecs had never seen horses until the Spaniards arrived. At first, they were terrified, thinking that men on horseback were monsters, half deer and half man. The Aztecs were also frightened by Spanish guns and by the Spanish sailing ships, which they described as houses floating on the water. Though they fought bravely, Aztec soldiers could not win against well-armed Spanish troops.
In 1535, Mexico became a Spanish colony. Aztec farms and land were shared among Spanish settlers, and the remaining Aztec people were forced to work for them. Spanish missionaries attacked Aztec religious beliefs and tried to replace them with European Christian ideas. But the Aztec traditions were strong and have proved to be long-lasting. Like their Nahuatl language, many of these traditions have survived and still influence Mexican culture today.